Okay, so let's talk about Psalm 4. You've probably heard it, maybe even read it a bunch of times, but what if I told you that this isn't just some ancient prayer? What if it's actually the script for a high-stakes political thriller? We're talking about a king on the verge of a coup, from his own inner circle. Seriously, let's dig in and uncover the drama that's been hiding in plain sight this whole time.
And it all kicks off with this one verse. You read this today, and, phrases like, turn my glory into shame or seek false gods, they sound, well, poetic, right? Kind of vague. But what if that's not what's happening at all? What if this isn't poetry, but a direct, literal accusation where the stakes are life and death?
So yeah, what is really going on here? Well, this is where it gets interesting. Once we start digging into the history, into the original language, a whole new story just cracks wide open. It's a story of betrayal, of sheer desperation, a king literally fighting for his political and, you could say, his spiritual life.
So our first step in solving this mystery is to figure out exactly who's talking and, maybe even more important, who they're talking to. This is the first key, and it changes everything.
All right, so we know this psalm is attributed to King David, but the really crucial detail is hidden in that one little word, amen. See, he's not just talking to a random crowd here. He is addressing a very, very specific group of people. In the original Hebrew, the phrase used is b'nai ish. Now, this isn't your everyday word for people or mankind. No, this term specifically points to the elite, the wealthy, the powerful, the high-born leaders of society.
And we know this isn't a guess because the text proves it. Whenever the Bible wants to talk about regular, everyday people, it uses a totally different term, B'nai Adam, which you see in other Psalms. So this distinction is completely intentional. B'nai Ish is always used for the leadership, the elite, which can only mean one thing.
This isn't some public sermon. This is a direct, in-your-face confrontation. It's King David looking his own cabinet, his most trusted advisors, right in the eye. And that simple fact just changes the entire dynamic of this psalm. Okay, so if David is confronting his own inner circle, what in the world is the emergency? What kind of crisis could be so bad that it's literally tearing the kingdom's leadership apart? Well, that's our second big clue.
Now, the problem here isn't what you'd probably expect. I mean, think about it. In almost every other psalm like this, the king is crying out about enemies, about armies at the gates, about battles. But not here. This is one of the very few that makes absolutely no mention of a military enemy. The threat isn't coming from the outside, it's something else entirely.
But the text does give us some hints. First, the people are crying out for good. Second, the king himself is praying specifically for grain and new wine. Now, in other parts of the Bible, like in Jeremiah or Psalm 85, that word good is often used as a kind of code, a stand-in word for rain and a bountiful harvest.
And boom, there it is, the second piece of our puzzle. The kingdom isn't at war, it's starving. The national crisis isn't an invading army, it's a devastating and apparently very long drought.
Okay, let's recap. Clue number 1, King David is talking to his top advisors. Clue number 2, they are in the middle of a massive famine caused by a drought. So now, let's watch how these two pieces snap together and reveal this incredible political drama.
See, in the ancient Near East, a drought put an unbelievable amount of pressure on a king. First, the famine itself was an existential threat to an economy based entirely on agriculture. Second, and this is crucial, everyone believed the king was personally responsible for the weather. And third, a king's prayers were supposed to get immediate results from the gods. No excuses.
But David's prayers for rain clearly weren't working. Think about the very first words of his accusation. How long? That tells you this isn't a new problem. This drought has been dragging on, and with every single rainless day, his cabinet's faith in him, in his leadership, and even in his connection to God is just crumbling.
And that is exactly what he means when he says they're turning my glory into shame. His failure to bring rain is a massive public humiliation. And in their growing desperation, his highborn men, his advisors, are starting to look for another solution, another god.
And in that part of the world, at that time in history, if you desperately needed rain, there was one specific god everyone turned to, Baal, the pagan god of storm and thunder. And this is the core of the betrayal. David's own advisors are committing political and religious treason. They're abandoning their king and their god to go pray to a pagan deity for rain.
So let's just go back and read that verse one more time. It's not a vague, poetic complaint anymore, is it? It's a raw, desperate,
face-to-face accusation. How long, my own cabinet, will you publicly humiliate me because my prayers for rain haven't worked? How long are you going to abandon our God for the pagan storm god, Baal? So, after all that, why does spending time digging into ancient history and Hebrew vocabulary actually matter? Well, because it completely revolutionizes how we understand the entire text. When you understand the background, what seemed like a kind of confusing general prayer is totally transformed. It becomes this tense, high-stakes political thriller. It's about leadership, it's about faith under pressure, and it's about a king just fighting to hold his nation together.
And when you see it that way, suddenly this ancient drama reveals these incredibly modern, universal themes. I mean, how does a leader navigate a national crisis? What do you do when your faith is tested and it feels like your prayers are just hitting the ceiling? And it really highlights that timeless human struggle, you know? The one between patiently trusting in a long-term promise versus desperately scrambling for a quick fix.
It really just goes to show you that sometimes the most powerful stories are hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for us to dig a little deeper. And it kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other hidden dramas just like this one are waiting to be discovered in the texts we thought we knew so well?